The bronze razor trembled in Lyssandra's hands as she stared at her reflection in the polished metal mirror. Tomorrow would be her wedding day, but not the joyous celebration other Greek brides might expect. In just hours, she would face a ritual so bizarre, so terrifying, that many Spartan girls spent sleepless nights dreading their wedding ceremony. As the sharp blade touched her scalp, cutting away the long locks that had taken years to grow, tears mixed with strands of hair falling to the floor. She was about to become a bride in the most feared wedding tradition of the ancient world. What made Spartan wedding nights so uniquely terrifying that brides would shake with fear? Why did the most powerful warriors in Greece create marriage customs that seemed designed to traumatize their own women? The answer lies buried in a culture so obsessed with creating perfect soldiers that they transformed even love and intimacy into weapons of war. This is the untold story of how Sparta's brutal pursuit of military excellence turned their wedding nights into psychological battlegrounds, where young brides faced horrors that would make modern audiences gasp in disbelief. To understand why Spartan brides feared their wedding nights, we must first understand the society that created these terrifying traditions. Sparta wasn't just a city-state. It was a military machine disguised as a civilization, where every aspect of life was designed to create the perfect warrior. From the moment a Spartan boy could walk, his fate was sealed. At age 7, he was ripped from his mother's arms and thrown into the agoge, a state-sponsored training program so brutal that many modern military academies would be considered summer camps in comparison. These boys were starved, beaten, and forced to steal just to survive. They slept on beds of reeds, fought each other for scraps of food, and learned that weakness meant death. But here's what most people don't realize. This obsession with creating perfect soldiers didn't stop at the barracks. It infected every corner of Spartan society, including the most intimate moments between husband and wife. The Spartans believed that everything, even love, marriage, and sexuality, must serve the state's military needs. While other Greek city-states celebrated marriage as a union of hearts and families, Sparta viewed it as a breeding program. The goal wasn't happiness or companionship. It was producing the next generation of warriors. This cold, calculated approach to human relationships would manifest in wedding traditions so bizarre that they horrified even other Greeks, who were no strangers to unusual customs themselves. The Spartan mindset was simple. If military training created better soldiers, then military-style marriage ceremonies would create stronger marriages and healthier children. What they created instead was a system of ritualized trauma that left brides psychologically scarred before their marriages even began. The horror began days before the actual wedding ceremony. Unlike Athenian brides who spent weeks preparing with beauty rituals, Spartan brides faced a transformation that was designed to strip away their femininity entirely. This wasn't preparation, it was psychological warfare. The bride was required to shave her hair completely, like the young boys in military training, and dress in men's clothing, specifically the chiton worn by soldiers. Imagine the shock of a young girl, perhaps only 14 or 15 years old, watching her beautiful hair fall to the ground as the razor scraped across her scalp. Hair, which in Greek culture symbolized feminine beauty and sexual attractiveness, was brutally removed in a ritual that felt more like punishment than preparation. But the psychological torture didn't end there. After being shorn like a sheep, the bride was dressed in men's clothing and left completely alone in a dark room. Not with her mother, not with friends or sisters, completely isolated, sitting in darkness, waiting for a man she might barely know to arrive and claim her. This wasn't just unusual. It was deliberately designed to create fear and disorientation. The Spartans believed that this trauma would somehow make the marriage stronger, that breaking down the bride's sense of identity would help her rebuild as a proper Spartan wife. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a form of hazing or initiation ritual designed to create learned helplessness. The transformation was complete. The young woman who had gone to bed the night before was gone, replaced by a shaved, cross-dressed figure sitting alone in the dark, waiting for her fate to arrive. The girl who had been raised with at least some feminine comforts was now indistinguishable from a young male soldier. And that was exactly the point. What happened next would make modern audiences question everything they thought they knew about ancient Greek culture. The bridegroom was expected to visit his new wife at night and in secret, essentially kidnapping her from the dark room where she waited. But this wasn't the romantic elopement that some historians have tried to paint it as. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Picture this scene: a young bride, already traumatized by having her head shaved and her identity stripped away, sitting alone in complete darkness. She doesn't know when he'll come. It could be midnight. It could be just before dawn. The uncertainty itself was part of the torture. Then, suddenly, footsteps in the corridor. The door opens, and a figure enters, perhaps someone she's met only once or twice, perhaps a complete stranger. The kidnapping that followed wasn't gentle or romantic. The groom would seize his bride and take her away, supposedly to consummate the marriage. But here's where Spartan wedding traditions became even more bizarre. The purpose was to make it more difficult for new couples to consummate their marriage, which was thought to increase desire and lead to stronger children. This wasn't about love or even lust. It was about control. The Spartans had taken the most intimate moment in a couple's life and turned it into a military exercise. The bride had no agency, no choice, no warning. She was literally grabbed from her place of hiding and dragged away by a man who was essentially a stranger, all while she was disguised as a male soldier and probably terrified out of her mind. The psychological impact of this kidnapping cannot be overstated. Modern trauma specialists understand that surprise, powerlessness, and sexual threat are some of the most damaging combinations possible for the human psyche. Yet the Spartans built these elements into their wedding ceremonies as features, not bugs. The nightmare didn't end with the wedding night. In many ways, it was just beginning. After the traumatic kidnapping and consumption, Spartan couples entered into what can only be described as a secret marriage that their own society pretended didn't exist. The bride was not immediately brought to live in her husband's house, but instead continued to cohabit with him clandestinely, sometimes for years. Think about what this meant for the young bride. After enduring the horror of her wedding night, she couldn't even begin building a normal married life. Instead, she had to continue living in secrecy, sneaking around like a criminal just to spend time with her own husband. The husband, meanwhile, was expected to continue living in the military barracks with his fellow soldiers. Men were expected to visit their new wives at night and in secret, treating their own marriages like illicit affairs. Imagine the psychological toll on both partners. They were married, but had to act like they were having a forbidden relationship. This system created a bizarre double life where couples had to hide their legal relationship from society. The wife would return to her family home each morning, pretending nothing had happened. The husband would march back to his barracks, keeping his marriage secret from his comrades. Both were trapped in a web of deception that made building genuine intimacy nearly impossible. For the bride especially, this period was filled with constant anxiety. She never knew when her husband might appear, couldn't plan for his visits, and couldn't build the kind of domestic partnership that other Greek women enjoyed. She was married but not married, claimed but not acknowledged, intimate with a stranger she was forbidden to truly know. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Spartan wedding traditions was how they revealed the state's true attitude toward marriage. It wasn't about love, companionship, or even basic human happiness. It was about breeding better soldiers, and every aspect of the ceremony was designed to serve that goal. The Spartans genuinely believed that the trauma and difficulty of their wedding rituals would somehow produce stronger children. The logic was twisted but consistent with their military mindset. Just as harsh training created better soldiers, harsh marriage rituals would create better breeding pairs. The suffering of the bride was not a side effect. It was a deliberate feature of the system. This breeding program mentality extended far beyond the wedding night. The secretive nature of early Spartan marriage was designed to build up sexual tension and desire, which the Spartans believed would result in more vigorous offspring. They treated human reproduction like animal husbandry, carefully controlling every variable to optimize the outcome. The psychological damage to the brides was considered irrelevant as long as they produced healthy male children who could become warriors. The state had no interest in the emotional well-being of women. They were valued only for their reproductive capacity and their ability to raise the next generation of soldiers. Even more disturbing was how this system normalized trauma for an entire generation of women. Spartan mothers who had survived their own terrifying wedding nights would then watch their daughters go through the same ordeal, perpetuating a cycle of psychological abuse that spanned centuries. The trauma wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. The most tragic aspect of Spartan wedding traditions wasn't just what they did to brides. It was what they revealed about a society that had become so obsessed with military excellence that they forgot basic humanity. The warriors who created these rituals weren't monsters. They were men who had been so thoroughly programmed by their culture that they couldn't recognize the cruelty of their own customs. Consider the grooms in these ceremonies. They too were victims of the Spartan system. These men had been taken from their mothers at age 7, brutalized in training, and taught that emotional connection was weakness. By the time they reached marriage age, many probably genuinely believed that traumatizing their brides was the right thing to do. They had been so conditioned to see everything through a military lens that they couldn't recognize the psychological damage they were inflicting. The tragedy deepened when we realized that some Spartan couples probably did develop genuine affection for each other despite the traumatic beginning. But the system made it nearly impossible for them to express or build on those feelings. The secretive nature of their early marriage, the continued separation, and the overall cultural emphasis on duty over emotion created barriers to intimacy that many couples never overcame. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that the Spartans genuinely thought they were creating a superior society. They looked at other Greek city-states and saw weakness, corruption, and decline. Their harsh methods, they believed, were the price of excellence. They couldn't see that their pursuit of military perfection was destroying the very humanity they claimed to be protecting. The wedding night terrors weren't aberrations. They were the logical conclusion of a society that had lost its way so completely that it turned love into war, intimacy into strategy, and marriage into a military exercise. The long-term consequences of these brutal wedding traditions extended far beyond the individual trauma experienced by brides. They created ripple effects that damaged Spartan society for generations, ultimately contributing to the decline of the very military excellence the rituals were supposed to protect. The psychological damage to Spartan women manifested in ways that the male leadership never anticipated. While they had successfully created a generation of women who could endure trauma, they had also created mothers who struggled to form healthy emotional bonds with their children. The cycle of emotional detachment that began with traumatic wedding nights continued as these women raised the next generation of Spartans. Children raised by traumatized mothers often develop their own psychological issues. They may struggle with emotional regulation, have difficulty forming secure attachments, and perpetuate cycles of dysfunction. In Sparta's case, this meant producing warriors who were effective in battle but increasingly disconnected from the human elements that make society strong and resilient. The secretive nature of early marriages also prevented couples from developing the kind of partnership that could have strengthened Spartan society. Instead of creating power couples who could work together to build and protect their community, the system produced relationships based on duty and fear rather than mutual respect and affection. Perhaps most ironically, the breeding program mentality of Spartan marriage may have actually weakened the genetic health of the population. Modern genetics tells us that genetic diversity and healthy parental relationships are crucial for producing robust offspring. The Spartan system, with its emphasis on trauma and emotional detachment, likely created stress conditions that were harmful to both conception and child development. The warrior culture that demanded these brutal wedding traditions was ultimately self-defeating. By traumatizing the very women responsible for raising future soldiers, Sparta created a system that undermined its own goals while causing immense human suffering in the process. Despite the horror of their wedding traditions, many Spartan women found ways to survive and even thrive within this brutal system. Their stories of resilience reveal both the depths of human adaptability and the tragic waste of potential that these customs represented. Some Spartan brides developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to psychologically distance themselves from the trauma. They learned to view their wedding night as just another test to endure, similar to the physical trials they had faced in their own upbringing. This mental compartmentalization helped them function, but often at the cost of their ability to experience genuine intimacy. Other women found strength in the very aspects of Spartan culture that had traumatized them. The physical training that Spartan girls received, unusual for ancient Greek women, had given them confidence and strength. Some channeled this into becoming formidable household managers, taking advantage of their husbands' frequent absences to build their own spheres of influence and power. The secretive nature of early Spartan marriage, while psychologically damaging, also inadvertently gave some women more freedom than their counterparts in other Greek cities. With their husbands living in barracks and visiting only occasionally, Spartan wives often had more autonomy in daily decision-making than women in more traditional marriages. Some couples eventually managed to develop genuine partnerships despite their traumatic beginnings. The shared experience of surviving the Spartan system created a form of bonding, and couples who could overcome the initial trauma sometimes found deeper connections than those whose relationships had never been tested. However, these survival stories shouldn't obscure the fundamental cruelty of the system. The fact that some women adapted to their circumstances doesn't justify the trauma they were forced to endure. Their resilience speaks to the strength of the human spirit, not to the wisdom of Spartan customs. The wedding traditions that terrorized Spartan brides were symptoms of a larger dysfunction that ultimately contributed to Sparta's decline as a major power. The same rigid thinking that created traumatic marriage rituals also made Spartan society increasingly unable to adapt to changing circumstances. By the 4th century BCE, other Greek city-states had begun to recognize that Sparta's extreme approach to social organization was both cruel and ineffective. The rise of more balanced societies like Macedonia showed that military excellence could be achieved without the psychological brutality that characterized Spartan culture. The birth rate among Spartan citizens also began to decline, partly due to the delayed marriage system and the trauma associated with reproduction. When potential mothers associate marriage and sexuality with fear and pain, they're less likely to embrace motherhood enthusiastically. The very system designed to breed better soldiers was producing fewer soldiers overall. The emotional coldness that Spartan wedding traditions fostered also made it harder for the society to maintain the loyalty and solidarity necessary for long-term survival. As other Greek cities developed more humane approaches to marriage and family life, they became more attractive to potential allies and less threatening to potential enemies. Perhaps most significantly, the brutality of Spartan customs began to be seen as barbaric by the broader Greek world. What had once been viewed as admirable discipline came to be seen as unnecessary cruelty. This shift in perception isolated Sparta diplomatically and culturally, contributing to its eventual marginalization. The fall of Sparta wasn't caused solely by its marriage customs, but those customs were emblematic of the rigid, inhuman thinking that ultimately made the society unsustainable. The same mindset that terrorized brides on their wedding nights also prevented Sparta from adapting to new military technologies, changing economic conditions, and evolving political realities. The story of why Spartan brides feared their wedding nights is ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when societies lose sight of basic human dignity in pursuit of abstract ideals. The Spartans weren't evil people. They were individuals trapped in a system that had convinced them that cruelty was strength and that trauma was a tool for building character. The wedding traditions that terrorized generations of Spartan women reveal the dark side of cultural values that prioritize collective goals over individual well-being. When societies decide that some people's suffering is acceptable for the greater good, they often discover that the greater good itself becomes corrupted by the methods used to achieve it. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss these ancient customs as primitive relics of a bygone era, but the underlying dynamics they represent, the willingness to sacrifice individual humanity for institutional goals, the normalization of trauma in the name of tradition, the reduction of intimate relationships to strategic calculations, remain relevant today. The Spartan brides who trembled in dark rooms, heads shaved and dressed as soldiers, were victims of a society that had forgotten that military excellence without human compassion is ultimately hollow. Their fear wasn't just about one terrible night. It was about living in a world where their pain was considered not just acceptable but necessary. The true tragedy of Spartan wedding traditions isn't just the individual suffering they caused, but the way they revealed a civilization so committed to its own mythology of toughness that it couldn't recognize the weakness inherent in cruelty. The warriors who created these customs thought they were building strength, but they were actually building a foundation of trauma that would eventually contribute to their society's collapse. The brides who feared their wedding nights were the canaries in the coal mine of Spartan civilization. Their terror was an early warning sign of a culture that had lost its way. Their stories remind us that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict or endure suffering, but from the wisdom to recognize that some prices are too high to pay, even for perfection. In the end, the Spartan wedding night represents one of history's most chilling examples of how good intentions, the desire to create strong families and protect society, can be twisted into instruments of psychological torture when filtered through a culture that has forgotten the value of individual human dignity. The fear in those brides' eyes was a reflection of a society's soul, and what it revealed was a darkness that no amount of military glory could illuminate. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.